Hello everyone, my name is Colin McIsaac, and I'm going to discuss Carolyn Shields' article, Challenging Racism in Our Schools, Good Intentions Are Not Enough. Challenging knowledge frameworks that perpetuate inequity. Although there is widespread acknowledgement of increasing diversity of students in today's schools, the educator workforce is still predominantly white. This is certainly the case at my school today. Educators and policymakers are often unaware of how continued power and privilege sustain colonizing and racist beliefs, policies, and practices. Political and educational issues are typically framed within the context of white cultural ideologies and perspectives. And many educators are uncomfortable addressing inequities and disparities in their workplace and are particularly ill prepared to address racist comments or acts when they see or hear them. Theoretical perspectives. Shields talks about transformational leadership theory and how it involves an exercise of power and authority that begin with questions of justice, democracy, and the dialect between individual accountability and social responsibility. The first theory that she talks about is when students are offered a welcoming, inclusive, and respectful learning environment, they are better able to concentrate on learning and academic achievement improves. The second, that education is not an individual endeavor, but a collective one. When students are taught democratic processes that promote mutual benefit, society as a whole is strengthened. And she offers 8 tenets or beliefs, and they are that a mandate for deep and equitable change, the need to deconstruct knowledge frameworks that perpetuate inequity and to reconstruct them in more equitable ways, the necessity of a more equitable distribution of power, the importance of balancing public and private good, a focus on emancipation, democracy, equity, and justice, recognition of our interconnectedness, interdependence, and global awareness, the need to balance and critique and promise, and the absolute necessity for moral courage. The importance of mindsets. Shields speaks about educators and the tend for them to be uncomfortable and tentative when confronted with issues related to diversity, race, class, sexual orientation, or gender identity. She explains that it's common for educational leaders to neglect the second tenet that we were talked about in the last slide and move directly to the introduction of new programs and policies. Now, that second tenet is the need to deconstruct knowledge frameworks that perpetuate inequity and reconstruct them in more equitable ways. So this is necessary to change policies, cultures, and practices of public schools. The socio-cultural context. Shields explains there are two dominant legal frameworks for addressing the needs of diverse populations, their human rights and their civil rights. Regardless of the framework, educators must protect these and other minoritized or marginalized groups in our schools. They must be shown respect and fully included in all of our learning activities. Well, it's very difficult to do sometimes, but we as educators need to find ways to be able to do that. To do so, educators must acknowledge that all racist statements must be addressed and not ignored. Educational and cultural challenges. Now, racism in our school is not new. It's been around for a long time, but neither is the reluctance of educators to address it. That perhaps is why we still have the problem in our schools today. Researchers suggest that many white teachers have a hard time talking with their children or one another about issues of race. Researchers argue that once teachers recognize that silence on these issues contributes to the problem, then they may be more likely to interrupt racism rather than ignore it. Now, knowledge alone does not deconstruct the prevailing beliefs and politics that sustain racial and class privilege. Challenging negative constructs. In schools where the student population is diverse and in which most teachers are white, there is a need to help teachers recognize that racism exists. This reminds me of my school. We have an all-white teaching staff and a very diverse student population. Teachers need to know that silence is not positive. Deficit thinking and systemic racism need to be addressed in order to provide a respectful and inclusive education for all students. Although racism operates on an individual level, it is also manifest in systemic and societal levels and needs to be understood and addressed at all three. So some possible ways forward that Shields suggests in the article are that transformative leaders, they must reflect on their own beliefs and mindsets to understand their contexts and to acknowledge the need for creating equitable and respectful learning environments. Listening to others and asking for help is not a sign of weakness, but of strength as educators work together to eradicate racism. It's not easy to in these situations, but asking for help is certainly much better than ignoring the racism that is happening. Democracy promotes relationships that not only make better schools, but transform better social situations. Transformative leadership acknowledges the need for moral courage in the face of certain resistance. And finally, racism needs to be addressed even if it is uncomfortable. It quite often is uncomfortable, but it's something that we need to address. So this is a picture of my homeroom class from this year. Out of the 15 students that are in the class, only 3 were born in Canada. We have students from many countries all over the world. That is what drew me to want to read this article. Now, I know that some of you work at international schools and other provinces other than New Brunswick, so I have a few questions for you. How much diversity is there on your teaching staff? How diverse is your student population? And lastly, what was your biggest takeaway from reading the article? Thank you very much, everybody, for watching.